Bava Metzia Daf Yud Ches. We begin briefly with a conclusion of a sugya. Abaye had said maybe it's possible to collect the ksuba without actually having a star ksuba. The Gemara says Abaye rejects that. And then we'll get to our next Mishnah, which talks about if somebody finds a number of shtaris on the street, including a get isha. The Gemara will speak about can you return a get that you find? You have to be afraid that it's not actually hers and therefore it's not lishma. So Abaye had said before, maybe it's possible to collect the ksuba without actually having the ksuba document in a place where they don't write a ksuba, they just expect you to collect with the get. And Abaye had said it's not possible. You can't collect with just the get. So the Gemara says, first Abaye says the reason you can to do this because the get doesn't specify how much the ksuba is. The Gemara is not so impressed by that. The Gemara says everyone knows how much the ksuba is. Chazal were matakin a ksuba. So the Gemara says that Abaye says you can't collect with just the get, because then if the guy claims he paid it, how are you going to know whether he paid it or not? What proof does he have that he paid? So if you'll say he should take the get and tear it up, he can't. She's going to say, I need to hold on to the get in order to be able to get remarried with it. And if you'll say that, we'll argue to him, if you paid it, then you should have had the Beis Din write a shtar that she's divorced, and that the reason he took the getaway is because he paid the ksuba. Well, he'll say, maybe I paid it in a place where there was no Beis Din to write that. And therefore, he's going to have to be believed to say that he paid it if it's collectible with just the get. Since he's believed, why did we say that he's not? We had said before, maybe the reason that he's not believed is because it's a place where you don't write a ksuba. So, but here you see that there's no way to actually get out of him being unbelieved there. So the Gemara therefore says that the reason must be there's no possibility of being able to collect with just a get and not a ksuba. And the reason that the husband is not believed is because a maisa ksuba, a maisa Beis Din, such as a ksuba, you can't claim that you paid. So we begin the next sugya with a Mishnah. Mishnah says if you find a get isha or a get eved or a document of a gift on the street, or if you find a receipt, you should not return it. Not return it to either of the parties, because I could say maybe it was written in order to be used, but it was never actually used. So, for example, the get isha, maybe the husband wrote it, but he never actually gave it to his wife, and therefore you can't give it to the wife. So the Gemara compares this to a sugya we saw in Maseches Gittin. The Gemara says the implication here is that the only reason you wouldn't give it back to the isha is because you're afraid that the divorce never actually happened. The husband wrote it, but he never actually gave it to her. That's a stira to a Mishnah we saw in Maseches Gittin. The Gemara is first going to ask on the Mishnah, and then the Gemara is going to bring a different number that asks from a Brisa. So here the question of the Mishnah says, somebody brings a get and he loses it, and then he finds it. So if he finds it right away, he could assume it's the one that he lost, and it's still kosher, and that you don't have to be afraid it's a different one and it's not lishma. However, if it takes a long time, then you have to be choshesh that it's a different one, and you can't use it. You have to go get a new one. Now here we don't say it depends how long it is. That implies that there's no issue of being afraid that it's a different one. So Rabbah answers. Rabbah says it depends if it's a place where there's a lot of common people passing through. Shearas mitzuyos. So if it's a heavily populated area, then you have to be afraid that it was someone else. If it took time to find it, you have to be afraid it's a different one. If it's a very unpopulated area, then you don't have to be afraid that it is a different shtar, even if it took a while. So our Mishnah is referring to where it's an unpopulated area, and that Mishnah is referring to where it's a populated area. Now the Gemara says that Rabbah actually has two conditions in order to be afraid that it's the wrong one. One, it has to be heavily populated, and two, it has to be that we know that there are two people around with this name, with the name of what's written on here, the same person in his father's name in the city that's here. So what the Gemara calls two Yosef ben Shimon in the town. That's the only circumstances in which you're afraid that it's his. However, if you don't have both of those factors, there's no issue at all. So Gemara says it has to be the way, otherwise you have a kasha from Rabbah on Rabbah. And the Gemara brings an incident that happened where Rabbah gave a psak otherwise. There was a get that was found in the basin of Rav Huna. It said on it in the town of Shiviri, which was on the river Rachis, and it said the names of the individuals there. So Rav Huna said, you have to be choshesh that there's a different town called Shiviri, and that there are people there with the same name, and therefore this is not the get that you you can't just return it to the people whose names are on the get in the town of Shviri. Rav Chisda said to a rabbi, go research this, because in the evening Rav Huna is going to ask you what you hold about this. So he went and he researched, he found a mission that said any Maisa Bezdin you can return, and therefore he was passing that you could return the get. No. The Bezdin of Rav Huna counts as a very highly populated area. So, and it was, Zmanru was after a while. So if the only criteria that Rabbah had for returning the get was that it should be a unpopulated area, here you should not return it because it's a populated area. So it must be the Rabbah has two criteria for not returning the get: populated and knowing for a fact that two people with the same name exist. The Gemara says another incident that happened where Rabbah followed his halacha. It was a cotton processing area in Pumbedisa, and Rabbah paskined that you're allowed to return it. You don't have to be chayshish that it's someone else's and it's not lashma. There's a bit of a question. What do we mean that it was the same psak as here? According to one version, it was a place where they sell cotton, and therefore it was a highly populated area. And the reason that he said you can return it is because it was not known that there were two people with that name. And a different version is a place where you make the cotton, you comb the cotton, and it was known that there were other people with that name, but it's considered an unpopulated area, and therefore Rabbah was okay with returning it for that reason. Now, this is the first version. The Gemara says, now Rabbi Zeira asked the kasha from a brisa, and he gave an answer. Now, the brisa says that if somebody brings again and he loses it, if he finds it right away, it is kosher, because it's the same one. If not, it's possible. That's the Mishnah, and on that he asks a brisa if somebody finds a get ish in the street. If the husband agrees, he could return it to the wife. If the husband does not agree, he should not return it to either of them. So you see that if the husband agrees, he could return it to the wife, even if it took a long time. That's a brisa, which is a stira to the same Mishnah we quoted before, meaning Rav Zera is not asking from our Mishnah, he's asking from this brisa on the same Mishnah that Rabbah asked from. Rabbah answered, and Rav Zera answered the same way. Here it's populated, here it's unpopulated, just like we said here. Now, does it have to be that it's established that there are other people with the same name? So there's two different versions of that. According to one version, yes. According to one version, no. So according to one version, he's agreeing with Rabbah. According to one version, he's arguing on Rabbah. Now, why did Rabbah ask from a Mishnah on a Mishnah and Rav Zera asked from a brisa on a Mishnah? So the Gemara says, I understand Rabbah didn't want to ask from a brisa because it's better to ask a kasha from a Mishnah on a Mishnah. But why did Rabbi Zera not ask from the Mishnah on the Mishnah? Why did he prefer to ask from a brisa on the Mishnah? So the Gemara explains, Rabbi Zera felt like our Mishnah is not such a kasha. Our Mishnah didn't say you could give it back to the woman. Our Mishnah said in a case where they're not moida, you can't give it back. The implication is if they are moida, you could give it back. Maybe the implication should be limited to a place where it's found right away. However, the brisa said specifically you can give it back without specifying can only give it back after right away and not after a long time. Therefore, that clearly says that you could give it back even after a long time. Our Mishnah you could have limited in the same way as the other Mishnah, but the brisa you could not. Now, the Gemara asks, according to the opinion that Rabbi Zera argues on Rabbah, and Rabbi Zera says you could return it only in a situation where it's uncommon that there are people there. But in a situation where it's common that there are people there, even if you don't know that two people by that name exist, you can't return it. So he's arguing on Rabbah in that aspect. Rabbah would say in that case you could return it because you don't know that two people by that name exist, even if it's common. And Rabbi Zera says you can't. It always has to be where it's a low population area. So what's the machlekes about? It says the machlekes is about how you read the brisa, how you read the Mishnah exactly. The Mishnah had said, it says, Kol Maisa Bezdin you could return. Maisa Bezdin, is that talking about a populated or unpopulated area? So, Maisa Bezdin sounds like it was found in the Bezdin itself, according to one opinion. It's found in the Bezdin itself, then it is a populated area. Why would you be able to return it in a populated area? It must be talking about a situation where you don't know that two people by that name exist. And that would be Rabbah's Shita. Rabbi Zera says, no, Maisa Bezdin doesn't mean in Bezdin. It just means it's a Maisa Bezdin, and it's found somewhere outside the Bezdin. And therefore, it could be that the only criteria is that it's an unpopulated area. And here, the reason why it's okay is because it's an unpopulated area. The Gemara now gives two other answers to the original stira as to whether you could return it. You don't have to be afraid that it belongs to someone else. Rabbi Yirmiyah says the cases where the witnesses who are signed on it were questioned, and they say we only signed on one such shtar, and therefore this couldn't possibly be someone else's. Gemara says, if so, what's a chiddush? Of course, you don't have to be afraid that it's someone else's. Marriage is, maybe we're afraid there are other witnesses with the same name, not only same city, same wife, same husband's name, but also different witnesses. Kamashman, you don't have to be afraid for that. Rashi says the cases where there is a hole in the get that he recognizes. Somewhere it says the hole next to a letter specifically, which would be a real siman, not just the fact that there's a hole somewhere on it. And therefore he's assuming that you need to have a real important siman. The Gemara says Rashi wants that because he is a mesubik if a siman is deraisa or derabanan, and therefore what level of siman do you need? Gemara brings an incident. Rabbi Bar Chana lost a get in the Beis Medrash, and then he said, if you require a siman, I have a siman. If you require that it be recognized, I recognize it. So they returned it to him, and he said, I don't know what is the reason that they're returning it to me, and therefore what halacha could I learn from this? Is it because simanim daraisa and because of my siman? Or is it because of tfis ayin, the fact that I recognize it, which is something which only applies to a Talmud Chacham, but someone else you would not return it to based on his claim that he recognizes it?